Join me on my travels as I explore extraordinary places and reveal bizarre tales and characters from our rich history. In this programme, now it's just a pile of junk, but once it could have changed the London Underground forever. The dreadful Hertfordshire tale of Clibon's Post. And why this card could mean the death penalty. I'm in Acton in West London, and from the outside this is just another big and rather characterless storage depot. Yet inside there's one of the oddest and most intriguing collections of historical paraphernalia to be found anywhere in the capital. An extraordinary shrine to more than 100 years of travel in London. This depot is where London's Transport Museum stores many of its historic buses, trams, trains, and just about everything else. It's a treasure trove of things Londoners have used over the years to travel around their city.
Absolutely beautiful.
Some of what you see here will go on display at the Transport Museum in Covent Garden. Other things rarely, if ever, see the light of day outside these four walls.
This, of course, is one of the famous London trams that used to run on tracks laid through the streets, and these continued in service right up to the year before I was born, dare I say it, 1952. And looking at it now, I'm struck by the sheer size of the thing. It's absolutely enormous.
This is what the Times newspaper infamously nicknamed the padded cell. From the outside it looks like a cargo wagon, but it wasn't that. It was actually the very first type of carriage used on what we now call the tube. And it took a bit of getting used to. You can see why the padded cell name stuck. It's very claustrophobic. Very small windows. Apparently the makers thought no one would want a view of an underground tunnel, hence the size of the windows. But they were wrong.
It's quite comfortable. A bit dark, though.
And the only fresh air that came in was when the conductor would open the doors, when the train pulled into each station. Passengers hated this, and it was scrapped in favour of more user-friendly designs. This is far more familiar to us all, and it was a lot more popular.
These carriages must look so familiar to millions of Londoners. They were actually introduced a year before the Second World War, 1938, and continued in service until 1989, 51 years. Quite amazing.
But none of this is what I've come to see. I'm interested in something that could have changed the whole landscape of the capital's tube system. It was potentially a work of genius. Even if this wasn't in bits, I bet there are very, very few people who have the slightest idea what it is, because there isn't another one like it anywhere in the world. It looks, doesn't it, just like a pile of scrap. Mike Ashworth from London Underground, you're the expert on this. What on earth is it? Explain.
You're actually looking at the fragmentary survival of the world's one and only attempt to build a spiral escalator, which came out of Holloway Road tube station. It was built in 1907, and the museum acquired it a little over 10 years ago.
So this would be a thing you get in the bottom and it would take you automatically up to the top?
It's the idea, and then when you got off at the top, the escalator would have continued back down again in the same shaft and delivered the passenger to the bottom, to the station platforms.
That sounds a brilliant idea to me. What happened to it?
It never worked. Well, we're fairly certain that it worked possibly for one day, and there's always this great story about, did it actually just break down, or was it actually stopped by a government inspector? And it's interesting that even nowadays in the 21st century we still haven't got the technology to build a spiral escalator like this.
Why not? That sounds easy to do.
It sounds easy, but I think actually it's a technology thing. We're still not quite certain actually how this would have operated. No drawings survive, and there's only patchy information about the man who invented it, a man called Jesse Reno. And I think what failed in 1907 was simply the componentry in many respects. What you have here in these fragments are elements of incredibly well designed and well developed engineering with frankly quite a lot of bodge. I think they got on site, started to build it, and then realised, they had to prop bits up or fit bits in.
So did this precede the standard escalator?
It was developed much about the same time. I think it's important to remember that for many years at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, the escalator was largely a fairground attraction.
Really?
If you'd gone to the White City exhibition show in, say, 1908, one of the things that you would have written excitedly home about was going on a moving staircase, which of course was an escalator.
If the spiral escalator had been an engineering triumph instead of a damp squib, then the tube as we know it today almost certainly wouldn't have existed.
If this had worked, our underground system, of course, now would look completely different, wouldn't it?
It would in many respects, because I think one of the things about the deep tube underground now are these very long vistas down escalator shafts, and the chances are that had this worked, in fact, yes, actually you would have had very, very different architecture and very different design in tube stations to this day.
And I haven't finished with the oddities to be found here yet. The spiral escalator takes some beating, but Mike Ashworth has got something else rather remarkable up his sleeve.
So what on earth is this totally bizarre-looking thing?
It's a very odd-looking contraption, isn't it? But in fact, it's a one-man air raid shelter from the Second World War, and this was found about 20 years ago at the back of Hainault Depot on the Central Line in North East London.
Extraordinary. So literally, this would be just to protect one guy.
It was put in places where key personnel required protection. So, for example, in mainline
I don't think
railway
I'd like it
stations,
at all. It's a bit claustrophobic, isn't
it's
it?
very small, and I have a suspicion that if you were anywhere near it when a bomb hit, you'd come out with your ears ringing,
You
that's
would.
for sure.
There's also not a lot to do in it, but I suppose that's the least of the problems at the time. What's it made of?
It's made out of sheet steel, so it's very heavy, it's very thick, and there's no two ways about it. It would have survived, if not a direct attack from a bomb. I think you'd have really got knocked about in it, of course. But it certainly, if you were, for example, where a wall collapsed, this certainly would, and did save lives. It's one of the few things really left from, you know, the myriad of defence works that were built during the Second World War around London, things like Anderson shelters, pillboxes, tank traps, and very few things such as this actually strangely survive nowadays.
How was this found?
This was found a few years ago. It was sort of lost in an overgrown shrubbery, so to speak, at the back of Hainault. Hainault was actually built for the extension of the Central Line that should have opened in 1940, but which was delayed. And because it was such a big building, it was used by the American Army, by their Transportation Corps. So of course it would have been very heavily guarded. And this had just been left and frankly overgrown. And it's rather nice to think of somebody coming along with a sort of lawnmower and suddenly hitting this and wondering what it is. But that's actually how it survived and came to the museum.
There's one last stop on my journey here, because the stories of transport in London, of course, aren't just about the tubes, buses and bomb shelters. They're also about the people whose working lives made it all happen.
Now I'm going to find out about what, to me, sounds like the worst ever job on London transport.
This is a tale of deceit, of theft and of the confetti girls.
In the 1920s up to the 1950s, on buses, trams and trolleybuses, the conductors would have a machine like this to issue tickets to passengers. So a passenger would board the bus or trolleybus or tram. They would say where they wanted to go. The different coloured tickets nominated what the fare would be. So you as a passenger would give me your fare and then I would issue a ticket to you. Before I give you the ticket, I would punch it in my little bell machine, like so, which would then make a hole. The perforation would then go into the bell punch here to keep a record of what the fares had paid to match the tickets that were left.
What was the idea of it all then?
Well, basically, when the bus conductor finished his route at the end of the day, he would be returning to the garage. He would hand over his remaining tickets, the fares he had collected, and his machine. They would then tot up the money with the tickets left to make sure it all added up equally. If it didn't, if there's some kind of suspicion or discrepancy anywhere with the money and the tickets left, they would then send over the bell punch machine to Chiswick's Works if it was a bus, where the ticket holes would be emptied out and counted.
And that was where the confetti girls came in. They would have to count every perforation from every ticket to provide the evidence if there was a financial fiddle going on.
So let me just get this straight. Somebody would actually count each of the perforations to make sure the conductor wasn't on the fiddle.
That's right, but before they did that, they had to separate all the individual colours into piles to count, because of course each ticket had a different colour depending on the fare that was paid.
So there could be hundreds, or possibly thousands of these little things in each in each container.
Yes, there could be up to thousands, yes.
And somebody would be employed literally 1, 2, 3, 4, red, blue.
Exactly, yes.
What an unutterably boring job.
Really? Well, you'd think so, but we have an oral history from a lady who worked in the early 1930s, and she actually found it not arduous at all and quite enjoyed it. We don't know if this is possibly because it was quite hard for women to get jobs after the First World War, and so therefore she was just happy to have a job and didn't mind the arduous counting and picking.
Nonetheless, being a confetti girl sounds like a very difficult way to earn a living to me. I'm in the town of Hertford. It's a prosperous place, attracting people from all over to its shops and market stalls. Back in the 1700s, it wasn't so very different. Busy markets, wealthy residents, in fact everything you needed for a life of crime. These crimes terrorised the local population, and when it was revealed who carried them out and how, there were dire consequences. Stay with us for the tale of Clibon's Post. The town of Hertford is a pretty and prosperous place, as it was in the 1700s, when it was also the scene of some awful crimes. And then there's the story of one criminal in particular, a Mr. Clibon, whose spirit has long since departed, but whose body won't be going anywhere. The locals have made sure of that. This is a tale of crime and the chilling retribution of local people who'd simply had enough. On market days in the 1780s, Clibon sold pies here. In fact, he would have been a familiar sight, chatting to customers, stallholders and shoppers going about their business. Well, that's what it looked like, but in fact, he was busy checking out market-goers. Often it's said by pretending he was blind, so he could get close enough to see who was carrying cash, or valuables, or anything else he could get his hands on. When he noticed a possible target, he'd follow them out of town and pounce, robbing his victims with the help of his sons and his knife. On December the 28th, 1782, Clibon was right here in the middle of Hertford at the market, where he spotted a wealthy-looking chap called Robert Whittenbury. And he saw that Whittenbury was carrying £200, his takings from the market, and in those days quite a tidy sum. Clibon then immediately made plans to make himself and his sons £200 richer. Now, Whittenbury was clever enough to have made himself £200 at the market. And what Clibon and his sons didn't realise as they lay in wait, hiding on this stretch of road, disguised in smocks and with blackened faces, was that Whittenbury was also smart enough to have cottoned on to their plan to rob him. As they leapt out to steal the money, Whittenbury's reinforcements arrived. The fight took place on this exact spot. Whittenbury's son and brother, along with a servant named Shock, all fought bravely. But then Clibon knocked Whittenbury's brother Benjamin down and drew his knife. Benjamin called to the servant Shock, who was armed with a pistol. "Shoot," he said, "or I'm a dead man." Clibon was shot and died instantly. Whittenbury had held on to his cash, Clibon was dead, and one of Clibon's sons was later executed for his part in the robbery. Today, right in the middle of where it all happened over 200 years ago, is this rather curious post. And I'll come back to this later. Clibon's body was brought here to the Horns pub in Bull's Green, and the locals all came to see the body of the notorious Hertford robber. They dragged the body in and dumped it right here. This is the original flooring. And whilst they stood around wondering what to do next, so the story goes, they started to kick and abuse his corpse in their fury. Some of them even mixed his blood with beer and daubed their faces. It would have been a ghastly scene. Then a coroner's court and jury was hurriedly arranged. But rather than take the body to a church or an undertaker, as would normally have happened, it was decided on a more appropriate and rather more chilling fate for the late Mr. Clibon.
So this is actually the weapon that killed Clibon.
It is, yes, the actual gun.
Ruth Stratton has written a book about Hertfordshire murders, and despite having researched scores of grisly incidents in the county's history, even she thinks the story then becomes quite bizarre.
What happened next to Clibon's body, even judged by the standards of those lawless days, was quite unusual, wasn't it?
It was, because his body was dragged back to the Horns public house, and the following day, being a Sunday, it was people came from miles around to see who this mysterious robber was, and there was quite a lot of rejoicing because obviously he'd been terrorising for quite a long time.
How did they know he'd done all the other robberies, though?
Because of the sort of nature of the way the gang attacked. They all wore smock frocks and blackened faces and came out with sticks and beat a lot of their victims, beat some of them to death. People came from miles around, and his body was dragged around the green in sort of a macabre carnival fashion, and it was a Sabbath day as well, so it was rather an odd way to spend a Sabbath in those days.
So that was very unusual for that time, for
it
body
was.
to be treated like that.
But that wasn't all. The fury of the locals didn't end there.
And so back to the post, Clibon's post. This wasn't put down to mark the spot of his last crime. People were so angry with Clibon that they actually drove the post through his body, and his corpse remains just down there below. It was the last act of vicious revenge by the people he'd robbed to make really, really sure that he never again committed those crimes down the lonely country lanes. And, of course, to serve as a warning to others. I'm in Bun Hill Row in the City of London. Now, in the 1700s, this area was the centre of an exclusive industry. Work that was regarded as so important, the government had a vital control over it, on penalty of death. The industry was the making of playing cards. But you wouldn't necessarily have thought of that as life-threatening, would you? I'll explain more in a moment. Here at London's Guildhall, the worshipful company of makers of playing cards, no less, has amassed what is probably the greatest collection of cards in the country. But what's significant isn't so much their gaming history. Once, they had rather more ominous uses.
Many of the very rare and valuable historic cards here record great moments in history. These chronicle the defeat of the Spanish Armada. These tell the sorry tale of the gunpowder plot. Each separate card is a small work of art. But they also came to serve another purpose. As governments tend to do, when something is popular, they put a tax on it. John Card is the current master of the company, and with a name like that, he sounds the ideal man for the job.
There was a very high taxation on playing cards in the late 1700s, at the time of the Napoleonic War, and there was a lot of sensitivity in the country, a lot of fear, and the government was very worried, and they did increase subsequently year on over a period from 1765 through to about 1800, the tax on a pack, one pack. When a pack cost a penny halfpenny, the tax rose from 6p to 2 and 6. And that is
huge,
a substantial amount. And that money really was used for as another part of the funds that was needed to wage the war against Napoleon.
So in a way you could argue that the sale of these cards helped the downfall of Napoleon.
Well, it could be said that. It could be said.
While cards were a record of what was happening in the country, they also became a subtle piece of political propaganda of the times. Many of these historic cards have anti-Catholic themes, or were supporting rebellion.
This was a time where people had very, very passionate beliefs, and they fought for these beliefs. I mean, although when you look at today's society, we just wouldn't be down that path. I mean, people are quite passionate, but not as passionate as they were then. I mean, they did fight for it. But the church was a very, very important part of people's life, and I think that's why you were able to excite people and incite people to take such actions of rebellion and so on.
But the government saw cards as a way of making money and helping to pay for those wars, and it realised that it had to make sure that the tax on them was paid. And that produced one of the more bizarre interpretations of the law ever seen in this country. In order to collect its tax, the government controlled what they called the tax card, the Ace of Spades.
This card meant the death penalty was hanging over the industry.
Back here in Bun Hill Row, the playing cards business continues as it has for hundreds of years. These rare cards have been left to the company by a deceased collector, and they're being catalogued. Here you'll also find Graham Living, who's a former master of the Worshipful Company. And had he been in that position in the 18th century, the Ace of Spades would have made him a very cautious man indeed.
They decided that the Ace of Spades would be the tax card printed by the Exchequer, and every manufacturer would have his own unique Ace of Spades. That card was printed by the Exchequer, and the card maker went to the Exchequer and bought his own Ace of Spades off the Exchequer.
So no pack of cards could be produced without the Exchequer's tax card to show that duty had been paid. But of course there are always some people who wouldn't play by the rules.
There was a case in the early part of the 19th century with Richard Harding. He was found guilty of having forged the Ace of Spades, which was the tax instrument card, and apparently executed.
That's an extraordinary thought, isn't it?
It is. In essence, it is not purely because it happens to be the Ace of Spades, but rather more in that it was a financial tax instrument of the Crown, and the mandatory sentence for forgery in those days was execution.
So this old Ace of Spades here, if I'd printed that without proper authorisation, I would have been executed.
One assumes so, yes.
Although the idea of capital punishment for forging a card didn't carry on into modern times, successive governments were obviously reluctant to give up on their idea of taxing our pleasure. The excise duty on playing cards lasted, unbelievably, until 1960.